nous allons aborder maintenant des études eckhartiennes et cuséennes. Pour respecter l'ordre chronologique, d'abord Eckhart, ensuite Nicolas de Cues. Et je vais demander donc à M. Bernard Mc Ginn de l'Université de Chicago de nous présenter son exposé sur, j'espère que je ne le prononcerai pas trop mal, Prospects and Contribution, Reflection on Nothingness, donc sur le néant. Allons écouter tout ce qu'on peut dire sur le néant. Il faut évidemment être un familier de Maître Eckhart et de Nicolas de Cues pour voir combien le néant est riche et peut nourrir de réflexion et de perspectives. Monsieur Mc Ginn.
I'll begin by apologizing for speaking in English, but I don't want to impose my terrible French on you. If I could put this in the language, the scholastic Latin, beloved of both Eckhart and Nicolas of Cues, ambice loquar, ne verba mea offensiva sint, piis auribus Gallicanis. And I also, of course, want to thank the organizers of this magnificent conference for inviting me and making this such a stimulating occasion. In the late Middle Ages, two extraordinary thinkers arose in Germany, the Dominican scholastic Meister Eckhart and the Renaissance Cardinal Nicolas of Cues. Each man's life was marked by the events of his time. In the case of Eckhart, the debates in the schools over the use of Aristotle and the proper form of theology, as well as growing fears about mystical heresy, help us understand important features of his thought. Nicolas of Cues' life was not spent in the schools, but amidst the contentious church politics of the era of conciliarism, with its calls for reform, not only in church structures and administration, but also in the troubled intellectual world marked by struggles among various theological camps. Above all, Nicolas sought to conciliate diverse tendencies in theology and in the church itself. Although they lived in different eras and faced diverse challenges, there were close connections between Eckhart and Nicolas of Cues. These were in part textual. Cusanus owned and studied manuscripts of Eckhart's Latin works, annotating them with care and penetration. Although he realized that some of what Eckhart had said was difficult and profound, he defended the Dominican and the links between his own thought and that of Eckhart against Johannes Wenck, a Heidelberg theologian who accused them both of heresy. A careful study of this response on the part of Cusanus reveals the intellectual and spiritual links between the friar and the cardinal. Both thinkers belonged to the broad tradition of the marriage of Platonic thought and Christian belief that went back to Origen and even beyond. More particularly, Eckhart and Cusanus were shaped by a special form of this interaction, a Christian Neoplatonism that was both dialectical and mystical. Such theology was Neoplatonic in the sense that it depended on the philosophy of Plotinus and Proclus. It was Christian, not only in its commitment to furthering the faith, but also because of its deep roots in Augustine, and especially Pseudo-Dionysius. The theology found in their writings, most especially in the case of Dionysius, can also be called dialectical because it insists that the God who lies beyond both affirmation and negation and can only and always inadequately be spoken of in forms of language that challenge ordinary speech goes beyond the opposition of simultaneous affirmations and negations, at least in the case of God, to explore the higher logic of the coincidence of opposites. Such a theology is also mystical in the etymological sense that it strives to discover and make real the hidden God underneath and beyond all created realities and appearances. The historical forms and ramifications of this tradition of Christian Neoplatonism are many, but Eckhart and Cusanus represent distinct though related modes of this approach to the intellectus fidei. The many essays contained in the new encyclopedia are designed to further our understanding of these connections, a task already begun in the 4 volumes of joint studies on Eckhart and Cusanus published by the Éditions du Cerf. The collaboration of contemporary French scholarship on Eckhart and Cusanus with the rich resources of the Cusanus research done at the Institut für Cusanusforschung at Trier make this volume a new departure in the study of late medieval philosophy and theology. The closely related thought of these 2 great masters, for example, their dialectical view of the divine nature, their panchristic ontology, their treatment of human nature as made in the image and likeness of God, and fourth, their understanding of attaining union with God. These and many more central themes of these thinkers are presented in this volume with new insight and penetration. I believe that this new volume will mark a major contribution not only to contemporary scholarship, but also stimulate further comparative study of these 2 great thinkers. And rather than try to guess about what these topics for collaboration might be, I thought it most likely that I would give an example of how my own work on the project has illuminated and furthered my own thinking on mysticism. One of the articles I was asked to write was the article on nothingness, one that would compare Eckhart and Cusanus on this important theme. This theme that was one of the central issues in the history of apophatic or negative theology. And although I had written on nothingness in the case of figures like John Scotus Eriugena and Eckhart, I had not had the opportunity to give it much attention in Nicolas of Cusanus. But I found the opportunity to think along with Eckhart and Cusanus about the meaning of nihil and its applications was very fruitful, not only for providing new insight into these figures, but also in terms of the broader study of apophaticism in Christian thought. So in what I have here, I'm going to try to expand a bit on the article that I wrote and make some further suggestions about the significance of nihil. The term nothing, nihil, niet, and the rarer term nothingness, nihileitas, nulleitas, Nichtheit in German, were understood in 2 opposed senses in the Middle Ages. While the original meaning of nihil was negative or privative, that is, the nothing that lacks being or reality, Neoplatonic development of a transcendent sense of the infinite first principle produced an eminent understanding of nihil. In Christian Neoplatonism, therefore, we encounter both the nihil of defect and the nihil of excess or superabundance. Actually, the earliest clear expression of this occurs in a text in Book 4 of Eriugenes' Periphysion, but I think it's implicit long before that. The first sense of nihil is the everyday familiar sense, is when we say, oh, that's nothing at all. The second sense is talking about what's really a compound word in English. That is, nihil means no thing, no thing. The eminent source of all particular existences, the no thing that grounds the universe and therefore by definition cannot be said to be a thing, a res. There have been many ways of presenting both nothing by defect and nothing by excess or nothing by eminence in Christian history. Some authorities, such as Augustine, created impressive teachings on nothing by defect, particularly with regard to the nothingness of sin. But Augustine did not allow for an eminent understanding of nihil that would permit us to speak of God as nihil. The apophatic theology of Pseudo-Dionysius and his followers, such as Eriugena, Eckhart, and Cusanus, not only allowed this usage, but also, I think, delighted in employing this kind of language. Dionysian and other full-fledged accounts of negating or unsaying God strove to show the limits of all modes of conceiving and predicating terms about the hidden God of the Bible. In some of these thinkers, apophatic theology also came to involve apophatic anthropology. Apophatic anthropology. Because if humans are made in the image and likeness of God, as we're told in Genesis 1:26, this means that the essence of the human being is in some way beyond knowing and understanding. It too is a no thing in the sense of being incapable of definition. Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century, John Scotus Eriugena in the 9th century both provide examples of eminent apophaticism applied to God and also to human beings. Meister Eckhart and Nicolas of Cues, each in his own way, also made major contributions to the history of the theological uses of eminent nothingness, God and human as no thing. So I'll start with Eckhart, spend a little more time with him, and I hope to have a few moments to talk about Cusanus. Eckhart's use of nihil, nicht, can be best approached from the perspective of the dialectical nature of his thought. According to Eckhart, at one and the same time, God both is, he exists, in an eminent and perfect sense, and also is not. That is, God is totally beyond what we know as existent reality. What is more, insofar as naming is a human activity, Eckhart employs ways of speaking about God as beyond affirmation and negation within a dialectical form of language featuring distinction, indistinction, similarity, dissimilarity, or more concretely, eating and hungering. That is to say, since God is the being whose distinction is his indistinction, or to put it more plainly, the one whose difference from everything else is the fact of being not different, that is, not other from everything else as the ground of all, therefore, the more distinct God is, the more indistinct God is, and vice versa. Such predications, to be sure, sound like nonsense from the perspective of Aristotelian logic. Neither Eckhart nor Cusanus denied the applicability of Aristotle's logic in the realm of created being. But both insisted that in the case of God, who is not a thing, the distinctions of Aristotle do not apply. Such forms of dialectical language, which do not really name God, but mark out the limits, the place, if you will, of trying to name God and what it means, are found throughout Eckhart's Latin and Middle High German works, especially, of course, in his famous commentary on Wisdom 7:27. Here Eckhart argues that, I'm quoting, God is distinct from creatures because he alone is indistinct. That is one and the same as all. Therefore, Eckhart goes on to say, this is a hard one, everything which is distinguished by indistinction is the more distinct, the more indistinct it is, because it is distinguished by its own indistinction. Conversely, it is the more indistinct, the more distinct it is, because God is something indistinct, which is distinguished by his indistinction. If you got that, you got Eckhart. For God is an infinite substance and consequently indistinct. Eckhart says this way of speaking about God is what he calls the negation of negation, the negatio negationis, Versagen des Versagens. The negation of negation, he says, is the core, the purity, the repetition of the affirmation of existence. Eckhart did not create the category of negatio negationis, which had appeared in Proclus and others. He did, however, make it central to his teaching about God, often using it in his academic Latin works and at times in his preaching, as in German Sermon 21 on the primacy of the transcendental term unum, or ein. Here he preaches, and I quote, "A master says, one is the negation of negation. If I say God is good, this adds something to him. One is the negation of negation and a denial of denial. One means something to which nothing has been added. All creatures have a negation in themselves. One creature denies that it is the other creature. But God has a negation of negation. He is one and negates everything other, for outside of God, there is nothing." The negation of negation is the affirmation of eminent no-thingness on the level of dialectical language. But when we move to the level of predicating terms of God in relation to creation, conceived of as other than God, that is the level of what Eckhart calls analogical predication, then we enter a strange world in which what can be said of God must be denied of creatures and vice versa. In treating analogy, Eckhart says, quote, "Every created being is analogically ordered to God in existence, truth, and goodness. Therefore, every created being radically and positively possesses existence, life, and wisdom from and in God, not in itself as a created being." Forms of what I call reversing analogy ground much of Eckhart's language of nothingness, nihil. So from the perspective of actual existence, that is the formally inhering existence of creatures, our existence, God is nihil, literally nothing, no thing. But from the perspective of divine transcendence, creatures in themselves are nothing because they are totally dependent on God for all that they are. Although Thomas Aquinas and others also said that creatures are nothing in themselves, Eckhart's usage was condemned by Pope John XXII in Article 26 of the bull in Inaugural Domenicum. These reversing patterns of affirming nothingness of God and creatures are brilliantly set forth in Eckhart's Sermon 71, preached on the topic from the verse in Acts 9:8, "Saul rose from the ground and with eyes open saw nothing." Nihil videbat. That is, he saw the nothingness of both God and creatures. At the outset of the sermon, Eckhart identifies 4 modes of nothingness contained in the description in Acts of Paul seeing nothing. And I quote him, "One meaning is, when he got up from the ground with eyes open, he saw nothing, and the nothing was God. Because when he saw God, Luke calls this a nothing. The second, when he got up, he saw nothing but God. The third, in all things he saw nothing but God. The fourth, when he saw God, he viewed all things as nothing." It is instructive in this sermon to see how Eckhart jumps back and forth between God as eminent nothing, that's numbers 1 to 3, and creatures as defective nothing, number 4. In the course of the sermon, Eckhart primarily explores the nothing that is God. As he puts it, and again I quote, "Paul saw the nothing which was God. God is a nothing, and God is a something. Whatever is something is also nothing." Reflecting on using nothing as a proper form of language about God, Eckhart goes on to say, when the soul comes into the one and there enters into a pure rejection of itself, it finds God as in nothing. And he continues with a very rare statement that's seemingly autobiographical, and I quote again, "It seemed to a man as though in a dream, it was a waking dream, that he became pregnant with nothing as a woman does with a child. And in this nothing, God was born. He was the fruit of the nothing. God was born in the nothing." Now, Sermon 71 is Eckhart's most sustained exploration of the nothingness of God, but the same message occurs throughout his vernacular preaching and is also found, although more rarely, in the scholastic writings. In both the Middle High German sermons and the academic writings, Eckhart is equally insistent on proclaiming the nothingness of creatures. All creation, then, is nothing in relation to God by way of privation or defect. But human beings are also nothing because they participate in no thingness in the eminent sense. Eckhart says that for human beings to be created in God's image and likeness means that on the level of their pre-existence in God, humans are one with, that is, not other than, the divine intellect. In his Questiones Parisienses, he reversed Thomas Aquinas' teaching that esse, or existing, is the preferred analogical predicate for God when he proclaimed, "I declare that it is not my present opinion that God understands because he exists, but rather that he exists because he understands." God is an intellect, an understanding, and his understanding itself is the ground of his existence. The ground for the primacy of intellect rests in its ability to know all things, thus demonstrating that taken in itself, formally speaking, intellect cannot be a thing. It cannot be a particular created reality. Intellect cannot be conceived of or conceptualized because it is not a thing. Rather, it is the capacity to conceive of and to create all things. It's a pure possibility in that sense. Precisely as imago Dei, the human intellect is the perfect and perfectly equal image or expression of the hidden God, and is therefore one and identical with the divine intellect, as Eckhart explains in a number of places, notably in his Latin Sermon 29. But if human beings also possess intellect, that is, we have particular intellects as created beings, because we have intellect as imago and not just as ad imaginem, humans are not other than God on that level. That is, they are preeminently nothing. And much of Eckhart's preaching is designed to invite his audience to strive to realize this truth in their lives. In one sermon he says, "Anything has as much of God and of the one and of one existence with God as it has of intellect and what is intellectual. For God is one intellect, and intellect is one God. Every kind of existence that is outside or beyond intellect is a creature. It is creatable. It is other than God. It is not God. In God there is nothing other. Hence, the intellect in its identity with God is also nothing other than everything else." And much of what Eckhart has to say about the whole process of letting go, detaching, decreating, breaking through is designed to help us to realize the nothingness, the no-thingness of the ground where God and the soul are indistinct. I'm going to turn more briefly to Nicolas of Cues. Cusanus had read Eckhart and was familiar with his teaching on God as nihil. But he developed his own outlook on how nihil and related terms could be used in talking about God and creation and, to some extent, the human being. Cusanus agreed with tradition and Eckhart in stating that creatures in themselves are nothing. In the prologue to Book 2 of De Docta Ignorantia, he says that in investigating the universe as the contracted maximum, depending on God as the absolute maximum, we must remember that, and I quote here, what is caused originates entirely from its cause and is nothing from itself. Similarly, in his treatise De Principio, Cusanus affirms, the creature, since it is nothing and has its whole existence from the cause, is truth in its principle. Unlike Eckhart, however, Cusanus resisted speaking of God as nihil in an unqualified way. This is primarily due to his radical theory of the limits of naming. Near the beginning of the De Deo Abscondito, the debate between Christian and a pagan, the Christian admits to the pagan that all conceptions of God are not really like him, because God surpasses all things. But when the pagan responds, therefore God is nothing, the Christian disagrees. He says, he is not nothing because that nothing has the name of nothing. God is also beyond any naming of something, an aliquid. So it is true to say that, and I quote, God is beyond nothing and beyond something, because nothing became obedient to him so that it might come into being. God's omnipotence rests in the fact that both nothing and something are subject to him. Cusa says, because he makes non-being to enter into being and being into non-being. Nevertheless, Cusanus was still willing to claim that God can be in some way spoken of as nothing. For example, in De Principio, section 34, as he reflects on how the ineffable is prior to all effability or speaking, he says, because all that is caused is truer in its cause than in itself, affirmation is better than negation, since negation is its principle. Therefore, the principle is equally prior to the maximum and the minimum of all affirmation, as, for example, not being as the principle of being is seen to be prior to being, because by means of the coincidence of maximum and minimum, it is seen as super-exalted. It precedes the being that is both maximum and minimum as though it were not being, because it is maximally being. The Latin here is sive sic non ens quod maxime ens. So the principle of being is not being in no way at all, Cusa concludes, but it is not being in the sense given. So the point is here that the term non-ens can be used of God in very particular kinds of ways. And I think you would find the same rather restricted use of the language of not being in the later treatises, the final treatises of Cusanus, written between 1460 and 1463, especially in a number of texts in the treatise De Non Aliud. But I'm going to skip those actual passages. So my point here is this. Cusanus is certainly willing to use the language of non-ens or nihil in relationship to God, but in a more qualified sense than Eckhart is, primarily I think because he has a different philosophy of naming. Similarly, when we look at the anthropology of Cusanus, I don't believe we find an explicit negative anthropology in the same sense that we do in Eckhart or in John Scotus Eriugena or in Gregory of Nyssa. But I think there are places one can point to in the De Visione Dei and in some other treatises where one could claim or possibly argue that there is an implicit negative anthropology in Cusanus. But to conclude, for Cusanus, as for Eckhart, these difficult speculations on nihil were not meant to be academic exercises, but they were practices for transformation in mystical theology conceived of as a way of life. In a letter of 1453, Cusanus said, "It is necessary for the person doing theology in a mystical way to place himself in the cloud above all reason and understanding, even leaving self behind. And he will find how what reason sees as impossible, that is, to be and not to be at one and the same time, is necessity itself. The negation of reason, of understanding, even the negation of the self leads to the same goal for Eckhart and Cusanus. It's the state of simultaneous being and not being. This is what Cusa means when he says, God becomes and God unbecomes. Gott der wird und entwirrt. It also means that we must strive to become and unbecome, and it is in our unbecoming that we will paradoxically meet the God who unbecomes along with us. Thank you.